Alright, in our last video and classwork we looked at specific angles and how we classify them. With today's video we're going to take this one step further and we're going to identify what we call angle pairs. We have 5 special angle pairs. They're called adjacent angles, linear angles, vertical angles, complementary angles, and supplementary angles. So what I want you to do as I work through these angles, I want you to fill in your graphic organizer that you have in front of you. And when we finish filling out our graphic organizer, then you will use your organizer to answer some questions. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, angle pairs can be, and come up here, angle pairs can be adjacent. Well, what does it mean to be adjacent? I want you to think for a minute. Have you heard that word before? When you think of the word adjacent, what does that mean to you? If we come over here and we look at our angles, we actually do have 2 angles. We have angle 2 and we have angle 3. And you notice that the 2 angles actually share a vertex right there. And that vertex being shared, if you notice that they also share a side as well. They also share this side. So we would call angles 2 and 3 adjacent angles. The definition of two adjacent angles are 2 angles in the same plane with a common vertex and a common side right here, but no common interior points. And remember, we talked in our last video about what interior points were. Remember, interior points are those points that are between the two sides. So we have interior points here for angle 3 and we have interior points here for angle 2. Notice that they are not shared by the 2 angles. Okay, let's take a look at our next one. Our next one are our linear pairs. Linear pairs are adjacent angles. Oh, we talked about adjacent angles, right? Remember, adjacent angles are 2 angles in the same plane with a common vertex and a common side. Alright, so we have down here angles 1 and 2. They do have a common vertex. It's right here. Okay. They do have a common side, which is this ray right here. Okay. But what makes it a linear pair is this. You notice that if we combine angle 1, which is from here to here, and angle 2, which is from here to here, what do we form? What is this? It's a what? It's a line. So a linear pair are adjacent angles whose non-common sides are opposite rays. So here's our common side, and here are our non-common sides. Are those opposite rays? Yes, by definition they are. And remember, what do opposite rays form? Opposite rays form lines. So here's your linear pair. And I want to remind you again, a linear pair, if I have angle 2 and I add that to angle 1, what would be the total angle measurement of our line? Remember that straight lines total 180 degrees. Let's look at our next one. Over here we have our special angle pairs. Those are our complementary angles. Complementary angles will be 2 angles whose measure has a sum of 90 degrees. So if we come down here and look at our 2 angles, we have our first angle that has a measurement of 75 degrees and our second angle that measures 15 degrees. Well, what happens when we add 75 degrees plus 15 degrees? That would mean if we added those 2 angles together, we would total 90 degrees. One thing I do want to point out here with complementary angles, these are 2 separate angles, but complementary angles can also be adjacent as well. You could have two angles. So if I had an angle here, and then I had an angle here, if they formed 90 degrees, then they would be complementary. These two angles here would be complementary. I'm going to go ahead and put the arrows on the end because we're working with rays. Okay, let's go to our next one. The next one are our supplementary angles. Supplementary angles, again, are two angles whose measures have a sum of 180 degrees. So if we look at our two angles down here, we have an angle with 90 degrees and an angle with 90 degrees. Well, 90 plus 90 equals what? 180. Now I want you to come back over here to our linear pair of angle 1 and angle 2. Could we call these two angles supplementary? Because if we add them together, do we have a sum of 180 degrees? We sure do. So sometimes your supplementary angles, if they form a line, they can also be a linear pair. Okay? So here's another example of supplementary angles. They can be two separate angles, or they could be adjacent angles. And if they're adjacent and supplementary, then we have a linear pair. Our last angle pair, special angle pair, are what we call our vertical angles. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with vertical angles because we're going to discuss those a little bit more in class tomorrow. But you can go ahead and fill this in on your chart. Vertical angles are two non-adjacent angles. So let's go back to our definition of adjacent. They have a common vertex and a common side. So if we looked at these, our vertical angles here are angles 3. They do have a common vertex, but no common side. And vertical angles are always formed by two intersecting lines. So I have a line here and a line here. They are intersecting at this point right here. And if we look at this here, we have angles 3 and angles 4. And we would consider those to be vertical angles. We will discuss these more in detail in class the next time I see you. But go ahead and fill this out for now. Alright, now what I want you to do, you've got your chart filled out. I want you to pause your video and I want you to go in, skipping number 2. I want you to go in and name these angles for me. Then restart your video and we will check them. Alright. You filled these in. Let's talk about what we have. Here we've got two angles. This one measures angle 40 and this one measures angle 50. Together they total 90. So we would call these what? Complementary. Let's come down here. We have two angles, two separate angles. One that totals 123, one that totals 57 degrees. If we were to add these two together, we'd get a total of 180 degrees, so we would consider those to be supplementary. Number 4, we have angles 1 and angles 2, so angle 1 is going off like this, and angle 2 is going off like this. If we were to add these angles together, we would end up with a what? What would we call this? Would we call this a straight line? So these would be considered a linear pair. Okay. Number 5, if we take a look at angles 3 and angles 4, I hope you thought about this one a little bit. If we were to take a look at these two angles together, angles 3 and 4 together, and then we came over here and looked at this angle right here. This angle 3 and 4 together along with this angle, which we see is a 90-degree angle, that means that these two would have to total what? 90 degrees, which would make them complementary. And our last set here, two angles of 78 degrees and 12 degrees, we add those together to get 90 degrees, then we know that these are complementary. Alright, I want you to finish the rest of your worksheet and bring that to me next time I see you in class.